Well, I'm delighted to introduce and welcome Dr. Charles Norchi, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Oceans and Coastal Law at the University of Maine School of Law in Portland. Among his academic specialties are international law, oceanic law and policy, and maritime law. He has published extensively in these and other areas, including writing about the Gulf of Maine judgment. That's, of course, the boundary judgment between the United States and Canada, the Deep Sea Horizon incident, and piracy and public order of the oceans. We hope we don't have any issues with piracy or public order in the Gulf of Maine. Among his many accomplishments, Dr. Norchi serves as chair of the Admiralty and Maritime Law section of the American Association of Law Schools. He's a member of the Hong Kong Center for Maritime and Transportation Law, and is a fellow of the Explorers Club in New York City. Like Dean Haddad, I think Emily may have had to leave, but like Dean Haddad, he received his Bachelor in Arts from Harvard and then went to Case Western Reserve and Yale for his law degrees. Please welcome Charles Norchi.
Stephen, does this mean I have more time? Always good to have a backup. I want to thank Stephen and his able staff in the Canadian American Center here. The staff has been fabulous in pulling this together, thanks to old friends from MITSI, the Maine International Trade Center, and the Consul General of Canada in Boston, Consulat Général. I am a law professor. I teach at the University of Maine School of Law. We're part of the University of Maine system. We are the best law school in the state. Coincidentally, we're the only law school in the state. We also have a research center, which I direct, the Center for Oceans and Coastal Law. We've got collaborations in China. We do a lot of work on South China Sea, Middle East, around the Persian Gulf, Korea, Europe, and of course, Canada, where we particularly work closely with Dalhousie University, University of Montreal, and Laval. So I don't know how much time I actually have, but I'll speak quickly if you listen fast. That's an Irishism. Well, my understanding is that Senator King, in his address to us, when we see the video link, I have not seen it, okay, would have addressed, or is addressing when we get to see the link, the Arctic Council, all of which I'm going to say something about. But I want to touch on common interests around the Arctic. So that's why I've entitled this, not having known what the Senator was explicitly going to address. I figured I'd make this as broad as I possibly could. The kinds of common interests in business, in law, in geopolitics, preserving the environment, indigenous populations around the Arctic. And the first point of note is the Arctic is an ocean. It may be ice-covered, frozen, less so, but historically frozen, but it is an ocean. It is surrounded by littoral states that have particular claims to resources around the Arctic, and then polar capable states that are not so close to the Arctic. Conditions are changing. The cryospheric conditions are changing. So the cryosphere, those of you who have not looked at climatology, those are the frozen sections of our planet, from oceans to the high Himalayas to the Karakorums and so on, Alps. Cryospheric changes means that ice is melting. Arctic temperatures have been higher, we know that. Snow, ice, glacier melt is enhancing. This is causing sea level rise, which has a range of implications, environmental, and even in my field, which is international law, where we look at maritime zones, baselines, etc. All of this is going to change because baselines will change, coasts are going to change owing to sea level rise. And that is creating challenges and some opportunities. One of the opportunities is increased Arctic access. And I know there's a session later on shipping and transportation. And I should say, some of you who don't know, there's a little bit of an Arctic mafia in this room. I've got friends in this room that I've presented with many times. They presented on this. Any one of them could have done this presentation. And the one thing we all share in common is promoting Maine's participation in these Arctic opportunities while researching and understanding the challenges. People live in the Arctic. People whose lives are being greatly impacted. They're indigenous populations protected under a range of international human rights instruments or treaties, and there are non-indigenous populations as well. And so what is occurring in the Arctic, these cryospheric changes, is affecting the people who live there. And there are a lot of claims and conflict, and how are they mediated? They're mediated through the instruments of international law. This is how these interests are clarified. International treaties, so the Arctic being an ocean, the primary treaty is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, fully applicable to the Arctic. The Polar Code, a more specialized instrument, which comes out of a very important international organization at the bottom of this slide, the International Maritime Organization in London. Has the United States ratified UNCLOS? No, we have not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Has Canada ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea? Yes, Canada has. Russia has. China has. Does the United States abide by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea? Yes, on a theory of customary international law. So our State Department says that this instrument, this treaty, is applicable to the United States to the extent that it reflects customary international law, which is state practice. State practice is states engage in because they believe they're obligated to do so. Now, that means it leaves out certain of the conventional, the non-customary institutions of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, we do not have access to that. The Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, which verifies a nation-state's ability to have an extended continental shelf and to have that extension recognized in the commercial world and by other nation states. We don't have access to any of those institutions until we ratify the convention. State practice around the Arctic, very important. The World Meteorological Organization in Geneva, which is doing so much of this climate work, along with the Climate Institute, the fabulous Climate Institute here at the University of Maine. And then the Arctic Council, which I'll talk about a little bit later. This is the whole United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I teach it in 13 weeks, but we could do it in one slide for 5 minutes. Don't tell my students. The convention maps the maritime zones, and it accords coastal state competence in these zones of what international users can do, what lawyers call jurisdiction. Jurisdiction, or the competence of states and non-coastal states, is determined by each one of these zones. Okay? Territorial seas, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone. Piracy was mentioned before, the book that I was involved in a while ago. Piracy only occurs on the high seas, so we don't worry about that so much in Maine. Although the last person that was hung, the last capital crime in Maine was for piracy, and the person was hung on Munjoy Hill. Claims, overlapping claims. Nation states are cannibalistic. Their primary resources are territory, people. There are conflicting claims still to be resolved in the Arctic region. And a lot of this is going to be played out either through international agreements, bilateral treaties, like resort to international tribunals, or just by managing the conflict. Let it simmer, but don't go to war. So since we are at the Canadian American Institute, and Stephen mentioned it, and I think I have 10 more minutes, I thought I'd say something about the Gulf of Maine case. United States versus Canada, which took place here. Anybody know what that is? Yes, that is the International Court of Justice, the Peace Palace in The Hague, And in 1984, the Gulf of Maine judgment came down from The Hague. It was a chamber of the court, which means this is a full bench, all right, all 15 judges. But this was a particular procedure called a chamber procedure, where the US and Canada chose the 5 judges that would sit and make the decision. So the 2 governments entered into a treaty. They couldn't agree where this boundary was. One government was contending that the other government was giving away concession agreements to oil companies in its waters. Lobstermen on both sides were fighting. And Richard Nixon was running for president. Why would you want to make this decision when you can outsource it? If you don't do that, you're going to lose all of New England, all those votes. You'll certainly lose a fishing industry. So this gets outsourced. 2 friendly countries, a treaty, an agreement. They go to the court, they say, you draw the line. They draw the line. And what was the line that was important? There's a lot of jurisprudence behind this. I have shelves of the pleadings in this case. And one of the the 2 great trial lawyers on each side of the case are still alive. One is Ralph Lancaster, who practices law in Portland in his mid-80s, and Yves Fortier, about the same age, who represented the Canadian side. They were the kind of the 2 brilliant trial lawyers that went after each other over this. And here's the line, and it divides George's Bank. Really, the most important resource was George's Bank, one of the richest fishing habitats on our planet. One thing was left out. Anybody been to Machias Seal Island? What do you know about that? What can you tell me about this line? Look at A. It doesn't start at the coast. So the governments in a sidebar agreement said to the court, choice of law clause, draw the line based on international law and don't touch Machias. So to this day, this is a gray zone. The US and Canada manage it. Lobstermen fight over it. Bird watchers in alternate weeks will go and plant flags, US, Canada. So. But it works. What about this? Back to the Arctic. Anybody know about Hans Island? Okay. Canada versus Denmark. It's kind of simmered down. People are a little more worried about what Putin is doing in that region, so they're not going to fight. There was a little snippet I found in the Toronto Globe and Mail. I'll read it to you. With all the Danish schnapps and Canadian whiskey, why not turn Hans Island into a binational bar? There's plenty of ice. Some well-informed citizen of Toronto. Resources. A lot of oil. Oil, natural gas. Is anything happening with it right now? Not with where the price of oil is, except there is something happening. An Italian oil company on a concession to Norway began drilling last week. Okay. Because they're placing a bet. Now, think about all of these contested boundaries. You're a shareholder in an oil company. You work for an oil company. Oil platforms are expensive. What if that oil platform finds itself in contested waters? What if the state that gave you the concession suddenly doesn't have competence? What if that concession, as we say in property law, is imperfected? Is there a cloud on title? So anytime there's a maritime, so Shell is facing this off the coast of the Congo in Africa, because the oil platform they put in Angola, they found out is actually in Congolese waters. Makes shareholders very unhappy. So from that standpoint, these boundaries have to be settled somehow, either by agreement or going to an international tribunal. This will be touched on later with our transportation shipping panel, and we've got experts on this here in the room. But these are potential sea routes. These are opportunities, certainly for Maine, certainly for Canada, for the rest of the world, but there are challenges. Environmental protection, those people that live there, the indigenous populations. And so shipping. Shipping is going to depend on viability, okay, mostly cryospheric change, which will dictate how quickly these routes become viable. State demands over those shipping lanes, and shipping economics. And there are people, there's certainly somebody in this room, two people that I see, who can tell you a lot more about shipping than I can. But if you look at the numbers, the size of the container vessels, the Arctic Max vessels that can actually go through here, are a lot smaller than, say, a Panamax vessel, which can carry many, many more containers. And I'm looking for the naval engineer that we spoke to last night, about icebreakers. Come on. We have 1.5. Claims. Anybody hear the Northwest Passage? Anybody from Canada? Okay. What is it? The Canadian legal position is these are internal waters. Maybe territorial, but internal. The United States, China, most of Europe, Korea, Singapore, no, this is an international strait. Now, why is that important? Because they're treated differently under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The state competence, jurisdiction is very, very different. This hasn't been settled. We're friendly countries, we manage it, but at some point it will have to be resolved. Mr. Putin, okay. You want to send a vessel through Russia, the Eastern Sea route there? 4 months notification, Russian route management, financial security for civil liability, pretty high bonds, transit fees beyond the costs of services rendered, all of which is in violation of Article 227 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which requires reasonable fees for transit through these waters. And then geopolitics, security. He, she, whatever entity controls the top of the world controls an awful lot. So the great powers are looking at positioning of nuclear submarines, controlling these areas for geopolitical reasons. And freedom of navigation is critical for the United States, critical for Russia. It is why the United States Navy insists on ratification of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, because we want our vessels to sail in any waters, anywhere. And I was in China in November on an arbitration between the Philippines and China. The United States Navy was in the waters around Scarborough Shoal. These are international waters. The Chinese are, hey, you haven't even ratified this. Go home. Navigation. And it's going to be important in the Arctic. Speaking of China, and I'm looking at the watch, if I can take 4 more minutes, I'll be done. Polar bear, panda bear. The PRC has big Arctic interests. That's the snow dragon. This is their primary icebreaker. They're building another one, and they've got plans for others. The Yellow River Station, scientists, we don't know how many, we don't exactly know what they're doing, but very, very active. And from a shipping point of view, okay, assuming the shipping economics works, the containers and so on, the class of the vessel. Let's take New York, Shanghai, Panama Canal, 20,000 kilometers, Northwest Passage 18, okay? If you look at any of these, if Arctic through shipping becomes viable, it is going to be greatly beneficial to anybody doing business between Asia and the West. And it'll have environmental consequences. And one of the key organizations that is working on environmental protection, polar security, is the Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council will be meeting in none other than Portland, Maine in October. And the eyes of the world around Arctic issues will be on Portland. If you want to learn more about the Arctic Council and a range of events that will be occurring around their meeting, Dana Eitznes is sitting over there, and she keeps on top of virtually everything with respect to the Arctic. And she's the person to talk to. It is a very interesting international organization. The United States is the chair currently. And I just want to draw attention to one thing quickly. We got the permanent members who are the Arctic states, obvious what they are. The observer states, all who will be here here in Maine in October, China, India, Singapore, South Korea, Poland, all outliers, you would think, but they all have great interests in what happens in the Arctic for different reasons. Those of you who are interested, our law school and the Oceans Law Center are conducting a conference partnered with the Maine International Trade Center, North Atlantic Development Office. Again, you can ask Dana about this. On October 3, it's an all-day conference on Arctic challenges in universities, and you're welcome to come. Merci.
Well, I think we can't miss this opportunity of having just a couple of questions for Charles. Yes?
Who are the principal beneficiaries of our not ratifying laws? Who?
Anybody who takes the old George Washington term of entangling alliances too far. So there's and I'm not taking a political position, but there's a strong neoconservative wing in Washington, in the Senate, and the Congress, and I think they totally misread the treaty. They worry that we're going to be dragged into a court. We can't be dragged into a court, an international court, because we, and certainly every great power, not small powers, but great powers, always exclude anything having to do with national security from an international tribunal. That's one. And the other issue is there's a requirement in the treaty that if you're going to be doing deep seabed mining, that a less than 2% royalty should be paid into a pot and distributed to countries, poor countries, for their welfare to benefit from the resources. So the Heritage Foundation, if you really want to get into it, read any of the Heritage Foundation papers, and I think that they're a misreading of the treaty, because mainstream Republicans, the military, the mining industry, and I could go on, oil and gas want it. So.
Well, please join with me to thank Professor Norchi for that wonderful address.